This episode of Frugal Tech is brought to you by frugalbrothers.com, network security tools for small to mid-sized business. Yep, it says we're live, so we should be good to go. Okay, Kevin, you want to kind of let everybody know what your position is with GFI?
Sure, yeah. My name's Kevin Hodak. I'm currently a team lead on the GFI FaxMaker sales group. I've been here at GFI for about almost 9 years now. I guess 8.5 years is about right. And started in support, moved over to sales engineering, now in sales, and been selling FaxMaker for about 4 years now. So a lot of experience on the sales side, but have that technical side as well. So can speak to all aspects of the product with you.
Okay. Sounds like there's a little bit of a party going on today.
Hey, that's Chip Beeler. You know him, right?
Yeah, right. I know Chip. That would explain a lot.
Never keep him quiet. Yep.
Okay, that explains a lot. Well, you know, I've been a GFI reseller. It'll be 8 years in June.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a long time. And what I wanted to do here was put together, some common questions that we get asked a lot about GFI FaxMaker. And I think the first thing, Kevin, can you kind of give us a mild, that overview of what a fax server is, what that device actually does?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fax server allows organizations to manage their faxes through a software application rather than managing individual fax machines. And so that software basically gives the users the ability to send and receive faxes from their desktop. So it has a lot of convenience benefits and streamlining workflow benefits over the individual fax machines.
Okay. So, a lot of people are on the opinion that faxing is kind of on its way out. But yet, that's really not the case, is it?
No, not. And I guess the answer there is it depends. For some people, it certainly is. We talk to customers every now and again that say they haven't sent a fax in years and never plan on sending a fax again. But that's certainly not the case for everybody. There's plenty of customers that we have that are still sending and receiving a ton of faxes. It's still a critical piece in the communications workflow for a lot of groups, especially in certain vertical markets, like healthcare being one of the biggest ones. But finance and legal, insurance, real estate, all of those industries still fax a lot. And really for a lot of organizations, even if they're not in one of those verticals, they may have a piece of the business that still relies heavily on fax for invoicing, for purchase orders, for those sorts of things. And really that's a good point to make, is that we still see a ton of faxing being used for the more business process type piece of the business. The days of somebody taking one individual piece of paper and faxing it, and then maybe 6 months later they're going to fax it again, that really is going away. You would just PDF and email it. But for those business processes that where the people on the other side may not accept email just because of their workflow, or that there's some sort of regulation that says they can't accept email, that's where we still see a ton of faxing being used.
So the next question that I have for you is, why would a company, that say, okay, we're looking for a fax server, why would we choose, say, FaxMaker over a competitive product? What would be the compelling reasons there?
Yeah, so with GFI, we really target the small to medium-sized business market. And what we find is our product is price competitive against some of the smaller vendors out there, or some of the lower-end solutions. But we have much more robust feature set. For example, some of those small competitors may only support analog lines for the connectivity, and we have many other options that we'll talk about later. And so things like that for the same or a similar price, you're getting a much more robust solution. You're basically getting an enterprise-grade product at a small business budget. And then as we move up in size to some of our larger customers, where we compete against the more enterprise vendors, it's kind of a similar story in reverse, that we have the core faxing functionality that they're going to need to meet their needs, but we still maintain that lower price point where we're beating the enterprise vendors on price and ease of use, less complex product, but still meeting those core fax needs.
Well, tell me, how does FaxMaker work? In other words, how do I receive faxes? How do I send them? How do I store them? How do I look at them? How does all that work?
Sure. So let's do sending first. So
All right.
on the sending side, users have a handful of options on how they can send faxes. Most of our customers are using the product through email. You know, the customer or the user just generates an email, addresses it in a few different ways. The most common being the number at faxmaker.com, or pulling a business fax contact from Outlook, and then putting whatever they want in the subject and the body. Those notes will show on the cover page, and then attaching whichever document they want to send out as a fax. And so it's really just as simple as sending an email. But we also have some other methods that can be used for sending, such as our APIs. We have APIs that are based around a file drop, where an application would drop a file to a folder. We would pick it up and then send it out as a fax. And we also have a web services API. And we have a couple of printer drivers that can be used. So I mentioned earlier that business automation, business workflow was one thing that's really driving faxing. Those APIs and printer drivers are used quite heavily to do that type of workflow integration. And then on the receiving side that you mentioned there, on the receiving side, FaxMaker can deliver inbound faxes to an email address or multiple email addresses, to a network printer or to a network folder, or any combination of those three. And those options are set up based on routing rules within the configuration. So if you have one user in the office that has more of a legacy workflow and they still need that hard copy of the fax printed out, you can say that their faxes get printed out on the printer in their office, but these other users want theirs emailed, so they're going to receive those in their mailbox.
And so when a fax comes in my email, is that in a PDF file, or how do I see that?
Yeah, so it's PDF and TIFF are the two formats we support there. So it just comes in as a TIFF or a PDF attachment. We also have the option to store those attachments on a network drive and just provide a link, just the UNC path to the fax within the body of the email. And especially a lot of our customers using on-site mail servers like that option, because it keeps the large fax attachments out of their Exchange server and instead moves it over to a network storage location.
And if I want to, now do I have the ability to archive those faxes somewhere for storage, or can we do that?
Yeah, you do. So FaxMaker has a few options there. We can archive everything that's sent and received to a mailbox just by forwarding everything to an email box, dropping to a network folder, or archiving to a database. And so really we can do any of those three. What I find that most of our customers will do is, they'll actually use some other third-party application to handle the archiving. So for example, if the customer is primarily sending and receiving faxes through email, they'll use their email archiving application to then also archive faxes. So it kind of makes sense that if it's all going into Exchange anyway, just to archive it with your Exchange mail for your mail archiving system. And in a similar fashion, if they're using the faxes primarily as part of a document management workflow, whatever they're using for their document management application will be effectively the archive for the faxes. But the key point there is we have a few different ways we can get the faxes into the format that's needed for that other application to pick it up.
I think one of the scenarios that we see quite frequently is a business that has multiple these, what do you call them, these fax machines throughout the office, and they're looking to streamline that. Do you have kind of a rule of thumb on, if I've got, say, 10 fax machines throughout the building, is there kind of a rule of thumb on how many actually fax lines that I would really need? Does a fax server reduce that number of fax lines I'm going to need, or would be about the same there? Or?
Yeah, typically it does. I mean, I've seen through my experience that the number drops about in half. So for your example with 10 lines, I would expect somewhere around 5 lines to be needed on the fax server. But one of the key points there is that we want to make sure that the customer is still going to be able to route the faxes to the right place. So if you have 10 fax machines, each with an analog line, typically you would have one number per line. So each fax machine has its own number, and if a call is coming into that first fax machine, it starts receiving the fax, and then another call comes into the same fax number. That second sender is going to get a busy signal, even though you have 9 more fax machines doing nothing. With the fax server model, there's some ways you can pass those 10 numbers, maintain the 10 fax numbers, but maybe drop down your number of simultaneous calls to 4 or 5. And that's what you're talking about with the number of lines. You can do some consolidation there, still keep the ability to receive faxes on all 10 numbers, but then that scenario I mentioned where you had 2 calls coming into the same number, the second call just rolls to the second line, and you're still able to receive the fax instead of generating a busy signal for the sender.
So part of the secret sauce of a fax server is you're making much better use of your fax lines than what you do in a traditional, have those 10 fax machines.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, just like I said, you can very easily have a scenario where you have a lot of idle lines, but somebody's getting a busy signal when they're trying to fax you.
And if I want to print out a document, sign it, and fax it back, I would just scan it and then send it as an email attachment is how I would do that?
Yeah, that's probably the most common way to do it. There's also some ways you can do it directly from a scanner or a multifunction device. One that we see used quite a bit is just to scan the email directly from the device. So I mentioned earlier that like number@faxmaker.com is an acceptable format for sending a fax as an email. That doesn't necessarily have to be from Outlook. It could be from a web application. It could be from your mobile device. It could be from a scanner. So you put the document on the scanner, you enter number@faxmaker.com, and away it would go.
Do I have to have? Yeah, I'm sorry. I was wondering if I have to have Outlook to use FaxMaker.
You don't. No, it can work with really any email client. So the way that it is probably the most common, or at least has been the most common. Obviously, this is changing with the move for email to the cloud. But historically, the most common way for customers to implement FaxMaker is with an on-site exchange server. So the way that flow works is that the user composes their email in Outlook. They hit send. That email hits the exchange server, and there's a rule in Exchange that says anything going to faxmaker.com, don't try to send that out to the world as a regular email over the internet. Instead, redirect that to the fax server, and then the fax server would send the fax out. So really, as long as the email hits Exchange and then that rule takes effect, we don't care what the user is using for their email application. They could be using some other client application besides Outlook. They could be an Outlook web access. They could be on their mobile phone. It really doesn't matter as long as the email hits Exchange and that rule forwards it to the fax server.
Well, maybe to jump ahead then, do I need to have an exchange? But do I need an exchange server? What if I'm using Gmail, or I'm using Office 365, or I'm using my email from my ISP? What do I do then?
Yeah, so the same basic flow still works. That the user sends the email, something's going to recognize that that's a little bit different than a normal email, and then forward it to the fax server. With the on-site exchange, you have that control to be able to configure that rule, an SMTP rule within Exchange to do the forwarding. When you move to Office 365 or Gmail or whatever, you may not have that exact same level of control. So what we have in FaxMaker is the ability to support other domains. We don't necessarily have to just use faxmaker.com. So for example, in your case, you could change FaxMaker to use something like fax.frugalbrothers.com. And then you would create a rule in your DNS entries to say anything that's emailed to fax.frugalbrothers.com is going to be tied to the IP address of the fax server. So when you send that email through your Google account, then through DNS it's going to route down to the local fax server. It's not going to be a hard rule in Exchange, but the net result is the same.
Okay,
the email eventually lands on the fax server.
And then there would be a setting within FaxMaker to use the Gmail SMTP server or the Office 365 Exchange server?
Right, and so that piece would happen on the inbound side. So as the fax comes into FaxMaker,
right,
FaxMaker will be pointing to your Google or whatever SMTP server for the inbound delivery. But for outbound, it's basically just handled through DNS.
Okay, so I'm okay even if I'm using my POP3 email from my ISP?
Yeah, you can do the same thing. What we see some customers do, especially on the kind of the smaller side of the SMB market, is actually use our POP3 downloader. we don't see a ton of customers using it anymore, but it's still there. It still works. Basically, the way that one works is you actually create a dedicated fax mailbox. So in your case, again, just to use an example, you'd create something like fax@frugalbrothers.com. And so anything you want to send as a fax, you would email directly to that one mailbox. And there's a couple ways you can include some instructions in the subject or the body of the email to tell FaxMaker what to do with it. And so every minute or so, FaxMaker would log into that mailbox, download any emails, read those instructions, and send the fax out. It's not, to be honest, it's not quite as elegant because the user has to remember to type those instructions into the subject or body. It's much easier for them if they can just do number@domain,
Right.
faxdomain.com. It's much more user friendly.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the hardware requirements and the operating system requirements. Can I put this on it? And unfortunately, we both know there's millions of XP machines still out there. Can I install FaxMaker on XP box? You
can. FaxMaker is really a server application, and with XP Professional, Microsoft lets you kind of treat XP as a lightweight server. So there were some server prerequisites that we need that Microsoft would let you install on XP, so FaxMaker could install on XP. Unfortunately, Microsoft took those out for Vista and has left them out for 7 and 8, so our server application won't install on any of the newer desktop operating systems. But we support all the latest and greatest server operating systems, and that's really where the product belongs anyway.
Okay, so, right. But we see that all the time. People want to install them on XP boxes.
Yeah.
And they're asking us, can we put on my Windows 7? No. No, you got to...
Yeah, and it'll still work on XP.
Yeah, okay, but it could run in a VM running like Windows Server 2003, 2008. Sure. Could do that.
Sure.
Okay, now, what about my... I think one part that it kind of gets to people is the fax hardware piece. How, that connection between FaxMaker and the phone system.
Yep, that's the piece that I think trips up everybody.
And I wanted to give a little attention to that today. I know there's there's more than one way to skin a cat. Mm-hmm. And people that if they're using like what we call POTS, plain old telephone service, analog lines, they'll try to use fax modems. Mm-hmm. Right, and FaxMaker does support a variety of fax modems, but that's not really for a high quality fax or any kind of volume faxing, is it?
No, and like I said, we support them. They'll work for kind of lower environments or where faxing is not critical to the business. But really, if faxing is important to the business, then we recommend the higher end fax boards. We've worked with Brook Trout for 15 years or so, and highly recommend their fax boards. They're great quality boards that give us really good reliability and performance. And if there ever is an issue, then they provide some really nice diagnostic tools and debug logging that give our support team a lot of power to go in and see what's going on. That's actually one of the big downsides of modems is that you get some of the old school AT commands and things going on in the logs, and it just doesn't tell you a lot about what's happening with the fax transmission. So if there ever is a problem, you don't have much to go on from a troubleshooting perspective. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of ways you can use FaxMaker and connect it to the phone network. Analog's probably the easiest. Just bring an analog line or multiple lines into a card. We also support digital connectivity with a T1 or a PRI into a fax card. Both of those, since you have a physical card, those also require a physical server. So you mentioned virtualization earlier. That,
right.
Those two options directly wouldn't work on a virtual server because you need the fax card to be on the same server as the fax software. But we have some other options that we can talk about those too that will work in a virtual.
Well, yeah, and it has been my experience over the last 3 years or so that more and more people are talking and trying to use what's called fax over IP or FoIP. Mm-hmm. And what is the advantage of FoIP over analog phone lines, number one?
Yeah, the biggest benefit that it gives you is that flexibility to virtualize the fax server. So you're not tied to a physical server or a physical card, which are both pretty obvious points of failure. You get to, since you're running on VMware or Hyper-V, you basically get all the benefits from a DR perspective that you would get with any virtual server. It's quite easy to bring that back up, even on different physical hardware if you ever have an outage. But the other benefit that you get that we see quite a lot from customers is it lets you leverage that voice over IP infrastructure. So to kind of back up a little bit on fax over IP, the way that fax over IP works is the fax software application is going to communicate over the IP network to something that is then going to convert that IP traffic to phone traffic. Now, that's something for most of our customers is their voice over IP phone system. It's their Cisco or ShoreTel or Avaya phone system that's going to translate that IP traffic to phone the same exact way that it's doing for voice over IP. So when I place a call from my Cisco phone on my desk, it goes over our local network to our Cisco gateway that then converts that IP call into a call out over the PRI to the phone network. The same basic things happening with fax. It's just the fax server sending a little bit different encoding across the IP network that then Cisco or ShoreTel or whoever is converting into phone traffic.
So these virtual phone lines, or virtual fax lines, let's call them that. Sure. They're basically a cost on my phone system. So if I have 1, 2, 3 virtual fax lines, then that's the same thing as I'm using 1, 2, 3 of those phone lines, correct?
Yeah, that's typically the case, and it's usually based around the number of simultaneous calls. At least as far as the phone system is concerned. Depending on the phone system, there's going to be some sort of configuration or licensing based on the number of channels, which is basically the number of virtual simultaneous calls you can make across that IP connection. Usually the cost for the actual numbers themselves, the DID numbers, that's coming from the phone company, not necessarily the IP phone system itself.
So I was going to ask you, I know that the Dialogic SR140 has been very popular with a lot of my customers. I'm sure with yours as well. If I download a trial of FaxMaker, can I also get a trial of the SR140 with that and kind of figure that out?
You can, yeah. The trial for the SR140 is included with FaxMaker. It's a 2-channel evaluation for the SR140, and we do free tech support for evaluating customers, as you know. So, if they need any help getting that set up, we'll do what we can from our side and provide documentation on the phone system. And to kind of go back to the fax over IP for just a second, as I mentioned, most of our customers are doing it with their IP phone system. But we do have some customers that are interested in the benefits of fax over IP, the virtualization of the fax server, but they don't have a phone system that's capable of handling it. So what we'll normally do for those customers is supply them a media gateway appliance that'll basically do the same thing. So it's a standalone appliance that's converting analog lines or a PRI into IP just within their own network. And so a lot of customers, that's worked out really well for them because it lets them maintain that traditional connectivity, but then get the benefits of the virtualization.
Okay, I know this is going to be kind of difficult, but I run into this all the time. We've got XYZ phone system. How do we know whether or not it works with fax over IP? Because I know that even though a phone system may support voice over IP, it may not support fax over IP properly or at all.
Yeah, that's true. And so Dialogic, who makes the Brooktrot SR140, does a nice job of their interoperability testing. They maintain a list, I can send you the link to it, of all the phone systems and gateways and even SIP trunks. You basically can move the gateway out to the cloud and pay somebody to do that as a service with a SIP trunk. So Brooktrot or Dialogic has tested a number of those and keeps that up to date with versions and everything that they've tested. And really, for everything that you see on their interop list, behind the scenes they have a configuration guide that details how they went through the testing and how it was configured. And we're happy to share those guides with our customers, during the testing and evaluation phase of the project.
You just mentioned SIP. Can you explain to everybody what SIP is and how that would work?
Yeah, so SIP is the protocol that's used to actually send voice or fax traffic over the IP network. So, in most cases, your voice over IP calls or your fax over IP calls are riding over SIP. They're all H323 is another protocol that's out there. It's more of a legacy protocol that we don't see quite as much. But the SR140 supports H323 as well. Either way, those are the transport protocols that are getting the packets from point A to point B for voice or fax over IP. And one of the key points with that is that all that's really doing is transporting the packets. The actual act of it being a voice over IP call or a fax over IP call comes from the way that the packets are encoded before they're being passed across. So you could have as you mentioned, you can have a phone system that does a perfectly acceptable job of encoding voice packets for traveling over SIP and doesn't even attempt to encode fax packets or support the codecs that we need for faxing. And so we run into that a lot with customers where they tell us that they've heard these horror stories about SIP and faxing over SIP doesn't work and all that sort of thing. We've been doing faxing over SIP for almost 8 years, and we have a ton of customers using it, a ton of really happy customers using it. And in a lot of cases, it all comes down to how SIP is implemented in their environment. The one where I mentioned that most of our customers are bringing something traditional, a T1, a PRI, an analog line, into an on-site phone system that's then doing SIP to the fax server. That's as solid as just bringing the analog or digital lines in directly. The customers are very happy with that model. It's with the phone systems that don't support fax over IP or the SIP trunks that don't support fax over IP where you have to be a bit more careful.
And you can, if you want to save money or you don't have the fax lines or that capability, you can't add whatever that situation is, you can actually hire these companies that are in the cloud to provide those fax channels for you for your fax server, correct?
You can, yeah, and we have a couple of different options there. The one we've been talking about with SIP, you're basically going to have the same components on the fax server side, the GFI software and the Brooktrout SR140 communicating with, you could say, a gateway in the cloud. So it's doing SIP out to a service like Level 3 or Babytel or Global Crossing, Broadvox, one of those providers that is doing that SIP to phone conversion in the cloud as a service. We also, with the release of GFI FaxMaker 2013, we added what we call our hybrid model. That's kind of similar. The biggest difference is that it's not using SIP. It's using HTTPS to allow the fax server to talk to an online service that is then handling the phone connectivity. So, for customers that have some, maybe they had a bad experience with SIP or they want to stay away from SIP, that hybrid model is a nice fit for them because it's all writing over HTTPS. So typically no firewall changes are needed. It's a very nice, secure way of doing faxing and getting the benefits of the cloud with the control and the security of the on-site fax server.
But I'm still going to need the SR140 component, correct?
With that hybrid model, you won't.
I'm hoping you say that.
Right. Yeah, with that one, you don't, because it's actually because the SR140 is kind of acting as a virtual fax card, and with that hybrid model, you're moving the fax card to the cloud, so you don't need that SR140 piece.
What's the other than obviously I don't have to buy the SR140 license? Is there any other advantages of doing the hybrid install, or is that pretty much it right there?
Yeah, a couple other benefits to it. I mean, one, the install process and setup process is incredibly simple. Whenever you sign up, and you can evaluate this as well during the trial that you mentioned. When you sign up, we're basically giving you a username and password for the online service. And so as you go through the FaxMaker configuration wizard, it asks you what type of connectivity do you want to use, Brooktrout card, SR140, or fax service. If you choose either of the Brooktrout options, you have to go through the Brooktrout installation wizard and do some configuration to, in the case of the SR140, license it, point it to your phone gateway, do all that sort of thing. And the wizards are good to walk you through that, but it is a few steps to get to that point where you're actually sending and receiving faxes. With the hybrid model, you just say you want to use that option and put in the username and password, and and you're done. So it's it's a 30-second configuration versus maybe a 30-minute configuration.
And do I get a separate bill for that?
It's all handled through GFI, but it is a separate charge. So that's one of the big differences there. Is that with the more traditional installs, you have more of a capital expense with the purchase of the fax server, the FaxMaker application, the Brook Trout components, and then your operating expenses are a bit less as you're just paying for your phone connectivity. With the hybrid model, your capital expenses go down because you're not buying the Brook Trout component, but your operating expenses may be higher as you're paying on more of a per page basis. So every customer is different. I've had customers that their T1 was more expensive than paying per page. I've had customers that are exact reverse, that the per page is 3 times the cost of their T1. So it all depends on the customer, and we're happy to help customers lay out all the costs and make the decision on what's right for them.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to get my mind around the ideal customer for the hybrid solution versus besides the money part of it, right?
Yeah. So one other benefit there that we really didn't talk about is the actual the technology or the connectivity itself. And there's really 2 main benefits there. One is you're really the high level equipment and phone connectivity with the service. So maybe as an organization, it doesn't make sense for you to buy a Brook Trout card or bring in a T1, or even better, bring in T1s from multiple providers to give you redundancy, but our online service is doing that for you. So you're getting high level fax technology with the Brook Trout cards and things like that. And the online service also has the ability to do things like dial the call the first time. If that fails, maybe try a different provider. So we're trying AT&T the first time and Verizon the next time and Level 3 the next time. And doing that in a small business would be very difficult and very costly. The other big benefit that the online service gives you is on the inbound side. Because of the way the service is set up, we're effectively saying that you're not going to get a busy signal because the faxes are being received by the online service, they're queued, and then the fax server retrieves them down. So again, to do that on the small business side would be quite costly to have that much oversubscription on your fax lines to guarantee no busies. So we see that as a big benefit of the service as well. And one point to make is that none of these are really mutually exclusive. We do have customers that are using some of the more traditional options, like one particular customer that jumps to mind. They're using 16 analog lines, so they have 2 8-port Brook Trout cards, and they're using that to pump out their outbound faxes. And they have one channel of the fax service set up. In their case, they're using the connection to our partner EtherFax to use the hybrid model for receiving because they want to minimize those busy signals. So they've kind of split the difference there, and they've said, we don't want to pay per page on outbound because that doesn't really give us a lot of benefits over the Brook Trout cards, but we get a lot of benefit out of the no busy signals on the inbound side.
Well,
we're
yeah.
going to use the hybrid on that side.
That would come think of it. That would. But does that on the inbound side support the DID on the hybrid?
It does, and that's actually a really good point with the hybrid model. Is that it's another big benefit of it. I don't think that particular customer is taking advantage of it, but others have. They may be doing some DID routing, but one thing that the hybrid model gives you is the ability to do DIDs really anywhere. So if you're a distributed organization or you have field reps and you need DIDs in 20 different states, doing that through your local telco provider would be a nightmare.
Right.
But doing it through our online service, it's really just as simple as sending us a list and saying, here's the area codes, give me a number in each one. And,
but I understand, I only need that one inbound line.
Correct, because everything on the inbound side is just pulling in on that one channel.
All right, that's a little bit of a money-saving tip there. But still, I think mostly we see the fax over IP with the SR140 and folks generally using their own phone systems as a rule of thumb, mostly.
Yeah, I would say most of the customers that are doing kind of the virtualized fax server approach are doing it that way. The hybrid's definitely caught on in terms of popularity, and we see more customers looking at that. That kind of ability to queue the inbound faxes is nice from a DR perspective. That if the fax server goes down, your inbound faxes are still being queued in the cloud, and as soon as you bring your fax server back up, even if it's just on a laptop running VMware, you can still bring your faxes back down and restore connectivity pretty quick.
And I think in talking in that vein, one of the reasons why people go to this is because if you have the card, the physical boards, and there's a malfunction, something goes south on that board, that can be very expensive to replace.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Rather than just running a restore from a backup, boom, you're back in business with software. Those boards can be in the thousands of dollars, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a lot of money. So it really is a money-saving. Even if you have the analog lines, you're still probably better off, I think, getting, like you mentioned, that media gateway and still having the SR140 in the software and do it in a virtual machine. My opinion.
Yeah, and I hear from customers all the time that we've virtualized everything except for the fax server.
Right.
That's the last physical server in the office, and it's usually because of that tie between the hardware and the phone lines. And so the good news is we have some options there, and we're happy to kind of act as the consultant in that case and help the customer figure out which of those. And we've talked about a ton of options here, but which of those would be right for them.
Well, I think one of my main reasons for wanting to make this little video here was because, and I've talked to IT guys on all the GFI products all day long, but when it comes to faxing, some of these folks aren't real familiar with I think it's the telephone stuff that throws them off. And they're kind of like a deer caught in the headlights when they start thinking about this stuff. That's why we wanted to make this video. I think my last question for you then, because another feature that is quite good, but we don't talk about much, is the OCR portion of FaxMaker, that optical character recognition module. What does that do? We do have one more question. We'll get to the purchasing, licensing stuff next. But just a brief overview of the OCR and why we should look at adding that to a fax server.
Yeah, so with the OCR module, as you mentioned, optical character recognition, we license an engine from Nuance. Nuance is one of the industry leaders in speech to text with their Dragon software, with image recognition, with everything around converting images to text to audio and everything back and forth and all the way around. So we include their engine. It's a really good high quality OCR engine that can take an inbound fax image, convert it to text, and then allow you to do some things with it. So the primary use of it is for inbound routing. If you're a smaller customer that has just one analog phone line coming in, you can't give everybody their own fax number because you only have one number. So you have to look for some other way to route those faxes. And OCR is one way to do that. So you could say if the fax has Joe's name in it, then route to Joe. If it has Susie's name in it, route to Susie. Or if it has human resources, route to the HR department. And so we have some flexibility there in the routing rules and how that can be configured. But one of the side benefits of the OCR, even if you're not using it for routing, is you can tell FaxMaker you want to keep a copy of that text version of the fax. So you'll get the nice pretty PDF that's formatted just like the original document, and you'll get this kind of ugly raw text file version of the fax. But even though it's not much to look at, it gives you the text version of the fax that's quite searchable. So if you're pulling that into your email archive, into your document management application, then that can be a really useful tool for searching back through the contents of the fax. And then if it's attached to the same email, you just open the PDF once you find it. You don't open the ugly text file. So nice kind of value add there, even if you're not using it for the routing purposes.
Okay, Kevin. I think the last thing we want to cover is when we purchase FaxMaker, the various ways that we can purchase it. And I'll go ahead and let you explain the licensing model a little bit.
Yeah, so the licensing is primarily based on the number of users that are sending and receiving faxes. And we have user licensing tiers starting with 5 users and going up from there. When you purchase the license, it allows you to configure up to 4 fax lines on a single fax server. I mean, as far as that licensing is concerned, it doesn't really matter if it's analog, digital, fax over IP, or hybrid. It just lets you configure 4 simultaneous connections. And then we have some additional line licensing if you need to go above that, additional server licensing. And then really the only feature license is the OCR. Everything else that we've talked about with email, PDF, APIs, all that sort of thing, printer drivers, Exchange, all of that's included in the main user license. And then the first year of software maintenance for technical support and upgrades is also included in the first year purchase. And then we have about a 20% annual renewal for maintenance and support.
And I can also license the SR140 when I purchase FaxMaker. You can also, if you want to go the hybrid route, they can take care of that as well at the time of purchase. Those would be separate
Correct.
to the GFI FaxMaker license.
Correct. Yeah, we can do all of those through GFI as well. If customers go out to our website and look at our pricing page for FaxMaker, all of the software components for the user licensing and the lines and all that are pretty clearly laid out. You'll also see some of the hybrid pricing because it's relatively straightforward. The part you won't see are the Brook Trout cards, the media gateways, or the SR140. And we really just felt like if we showed all that, we're going to have 100 more part numbers on that list, and it just very quickly gets to be overwhelming. And we want to just make sure customers get to the right place. So if you give us a call, we're happy to help you figure out which of those is right.
That's why it makes a lot of sense to work with a partner reseller.
Agreed.
To kind of walk you through some of that stuff and get you going down the right path. Well, Kevin, I think we've pretty much answered all the questions I had in mind. Is there anything you think you can add to this or want to add to it?
No, I think it's really good. I think we've hit most of the highlights. We should do it again sometime with FaxMaker Online.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, we'll wrap up this interview with Kevin. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely, Bruce. I appreciate you having me.